Bible study for this week. We are finally, after a long quarter, actually back in the regularly scheduled programming, if you will, of the encounter material from the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Our passage today comes from the Gospel of John, the 16th chapter. And just before we get to this passage, Jesus describes what is going on. And this is at the Last Supper. And he tells disciples that they're about to be in a lot of pain, but it will be pain like childbirth, where a woman goes through tremendous anguish, but then gives birth to a brand new life. And all of the pain is almost forgotten in the midst of the great joy of the new life. And he explains that to them, and they are not understanding at all. Maybe partly because if it was just the male disciples, there's just a bunch of men there in that room. We don't know who all was in there. But then he continues on, beginning with the 25th verse, and he says, I've said these things to you in figures of speech, the idea of the analogy of the woman in labor. The hour is coming when I'll no longer speak to you in figures, but I will tell you plainly of the Father. On that day you will ask in my name. I do not say that I will ask for the Father on your behalf, for the Father himself loves you, because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. I came from the Father and have come into the world. Again, I am leaving the world and I am going to the Father. His disciples said, Yes, now you are speaking plainly, not in any figure of speech. Now we know that you know all things, and do not need to have anyone question you. By this we believe that you came from God. Jesus answered them, Do you now believe? The hour is coming, indeed it has come, when you will be scattered, each one to his home, and you will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. I've said this to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you face persecution, but take courage. I have conquered the world. Well, I am sure that every one of us have had the very uncomfortable position of trying to figure out how can I forgive someone who has wronged me. We know that we are called by Christ to forgive. We even know that forgiving can be good for us. And yet forgiving is so very, very hard because we remember what happened and we remember how much pain we had and we struggle to forgive. And that's just kind of part of what it is to be human. And hopefully eventually we can forgive. But can you imagine how difficult it would be able to forgive right in the middle of the hurt as the person is hurting us, or while the person is still hurting us and is continuing to hurt us, or even sometimes we just know if I do X, Y, or Z, I know how so-and-so is going to react, and it's not going to be pleasant, it's not going to be positive, and yet if there was some way we could forgive them even before it ever happens. And the answer for us is going to be that's going to be very, very difficult to do. And yet that's exactly what we see going on in this morning's lesson. Jesus knows that his disciples are going to abandon him. And not only does he forgive them, but even blesses them there at the Last Supper, in spite of the fact that this is going on. And on the very next day, as others are nailing his hands and his feet into the cross, he will pray, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And just think about that for a moment. Right in the middle of all of this hurt and trauma that is happening to Jesus, he is able to forgive and pray for forgiveness then. I hope that, or maybe I shouldn't hope this, I know how hard that is for me. I assume that is hard for you. And yet what I do hope is that we will come to the point through the power of Jesus, perhaps through this passage today, where we can offer forgiveness and love even in the midst of the hurt and the pain. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. So the setting for this passage is in the Gospel of John, and the setting is the Last Supper. And you may be aware John has chapter after chapter after chapter of Jesus and the Last Supper. We have more information, if you will, from the Last Supper in John than any other Gospel. But over in Luke's Gospel, there's this wonderful verse where Jesus says to the disciples at Last Supper, how greatly have I desired to have this meal with you. He knows that they are going to abandon him. He knows that Peter is going to deny him, and yet he still desires to have this meal with his friends, to be there at the supper, partly because he is laying out for them in ways they'll only understand, and looking back in times to come, how the Passover lamb of the Passover supper is exactly what he will be doing the next day, sacrificing himself for his disciples and indeed for all the world. And so he knows that these disciples are human, and he knows that they are frail, and he knows that they are going to fail him, but he also knows that they are going to rise from the ashes of their defeat, just as he is going to rise from the dead, and they are going to become not ever perfect, but powerful, powerful witnesses for him, and many of those around that table are going to willingly go to their deaths for Christ, and they are going to find ways to ask for forgiveness, even of those who are persecuting them at that time. And so I think in some ways, because he can see so far into the future, he knows what they're going to become, and he sees that even more than he sees the frail humanity that is before them. And so he says, basically, I'm going to talk straight to you now. I've been talking in these figures of speech, no more. No stories, no illusions, no analogies. Now I'm going to talk to you straight. And he says the time is coming, it's coming fast, when you're going to talk directly to God. He says, I'm not going to intercede for you. And he's not saying that I refuse to do it. He's saying, I'm not going to have to. But rather, you're going to ask God whatever you want to ask God in my name, and God is going to respond to you because God loves you. And so God's going to respond to you. Now, they don't understand that now, of course, but the reason that this is going to happen is because of what he is about to do. When he dies on the cross, the veil and the curtain in the temple gets torn into. We have direct access to God through Jesus, and through his name, through what he did, we can have access to God. We can speak to God, and God who loves us will respond to us. And so he's telling us, I'm giving you this blessing. I'm giving you my life. Even though you're going to abandon me, even though you're going to scatter, I'm giving to you not only my life, but through my death, I'm giving to you access to God. Well, there's kind of a funny scene in a lot of Army movies, or particularly if it's a comedy, where the commander says, I need a volunteer to do this very difficult mission. And all the soldiers that are standing in line, they all take one step backwards, except one soldier who kind of isn't in on the joke. And he is left in the forefront, and it looks like he's taken a step forward. And so he gets volunteered, if you will, because everyone else has taken a step backward. Well, that's kind of what goes on with Jesus, except Jesus is volunteering. And yet, when Jesus steps forward, all the other disciples step back. They actually turn tail and run and leave him and abandon him. And it's not so funny then. Jesus is about to go through the worst night of his life, as he will be arrested, and he will be tried and beaten, and he will have no one there except for the presence of the Father to be there with him. Peter will follow for a little ways. We'll go into that courtyard, but then when Peter is questioned, he will deny even knowing Jesus, and eventually he also runs away and abandons Jesus. And yet Jesus tells his disciples, and he's telling us something very important as well, when he says, I am not alone in the world, because the Father is with me. And not only is he saying that about himself, but he's actually reminding us that's true of us as well. When we feel alone and abandoned in the world, we are not fully alone or abandoned, because the Father is with them. Now, sometimes we are going to feel alone and abandoned. We may even feel abandoned by God. And when we do, we can remember that Jesus prayed, my God, why have you forsaken me? He felt abandoned, but he knew he wasn't, even in that moment when he felt abandoned. It's this idea that we know with our heads, even sometimes we can't feel with our hearts, that God is always with us. And that can be sometimes enough, maybe just enough, but enough to help us take that very next step, get through that very next minute or that very next hour. The last verse of this passage is the most powerful one in the passage, and we have heard it probably quoted lots, and I want us to think on it for a little bit. Jesus says, I've said this to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you face persecution, but take courage, I have conquered the world. And Jesus is setting up a contradiction in this verse, or a contrast, and it almost seems like it's a contradiction, or maybe even a paradox. What do we have in Jesus? In me, he says, you may have peace. What do we have in the world? In the world, you face persecution. Now, Jesus isn't saying that you have a choice. You can either have peace or you can have persecution. He's actually saying both of these are simultaneously true. In me, you'll have peace, even while in the world you have persecution. So take courage, because I have conquered the world. Well, I want to broaden that word persecution out a little bit. When we hear persecution, we think religious persecution, and that is a lot of it. And Jesus is definitely speaking of that. And the disciples will give their literal lives for the sake of Jesus in ways that we may not be called on to do that. There is not true religious persecution in the United States. And I know some of you will disagree with me, but we really are not persecuted the way some in the world are, where they are threatened with their very lives if they are witnesses for Christ. And Jesus is talking about that kind of persecution here. But the wider term really is chaos. In the world there will be chaos. And chaos is wherever evil reigns. In our Wednesday evening study of the the book of Revelation, we've been talking about the chaos dragon that we see throughout Scripture. In the very beginning, the Spirit of God is flowing over the waters and bringing order out of the chaos. And time and again in Scriptures, this chaos dragon kind of arises. Pharaoh is described kind of as the chaos dragon. Goliath is described as the chaos dragon. When Jesus walks across the water and calms the seas, what he is doing is showing his power over chaos. And so wherever chaos is, that is the power of evil. And so in this world, we're going to have chaos. Cancer is, unfortunately, a perfect example of this. Cancer is normal cells that become chaotic and begin dividing in ways they're not supposed to be, and rather than doing helpful things, they become tumors that eventually can cause great pain and trouble, and of course even cause the end of life. Well, that is chaos. That is the normal order of things getting turned upside down. And Jesus says, in this world you are going to have chaos. It may be religious persecution, it may be cancer, it may be problems within your family or dissension within the church or whatever. Anytime there's any kind of chaos, that's the power of evil at work. But Jesus says, in me you have peace. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the chaos is completely tamed for the moment. But what he says, of course, is take courage, for I have conquered the world. You can face the chaos. You can actually fight the chaos with courage, because I have conquered the world. Now, through his death, Jesus enters into the chaos, and death is the ultimate chaos. When we die, what happens? Our bodies break down. When we're dead, no longer can our bodies sustain themselves, and we break down. Ashes you are, and to ashes you shall return. Ashes and dust. Good Friday, the Ash Wednesday mantra. Our bodies break down into chaos, and Jesus descends into that chaos. But through his death, he conquers the chaos, and he arises. And so then he is able to say, as he said just a few days or even maybe a week or so before this Last Supper at the tomb of Lazarus, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. And those who believe in me, even though they die, even though they get consumed, if you will, by chaos, yet will they live. And then he says, and actually they never truly die because of his gift to us of his life. Now, this is kind of a poor analogy, and Jesus wasn't speaking in analogies, but stick with me for a moment. I don't play video games anymore, but there was a time when I played some video games, and particularly I played them on the computer, and you could sometimes find these cheat codes that the programmers had put into the game, and if you entered the right phrase or whatever, if you could enter the cheat code into the game, your character could gain unlimited lives. And so it didn't matter if the character got eaten or squashed or whatever, they would just stand back up again and keep going. And so once you entered that cheat code in, you knew you were going to finish the game. You were going to eventually, if you were patient enough, you were going to make it through. You wouldn't just lose your 3 lives or whatever and have to start over, but eventually you would make it all the way through and you would finish the game. There's a sense in which that's what Jesus is saying. Take courage, I've conquered the world. And it isn't a cheat code, but you've already won. I've already conquered death. I've already conquered chaos. And so you can, with great courage, move forward and know that no matter what happens, you're still going to ultimately be a victor. Now, there's a huge difference between video games and real life. In a video game, my character gets squashed, my character gets chewed up, and I don't feel it. In the real world, I get chewed up, figuratively maybe. I get squashed or attacked, and I feel it. Either literally I feel it, or I feel it figuratively because people are coming after me and I'm feeling attacked, feeling threatened, or whatever. And Jesus is saying, in the world, you're going to face this. You're going to feel this, just like the next day he was going to feel all of that stuff. And yet, take courage, do what I'm calling you to do, because I've already conquered the world. In fact, evil is already defeated. It just doesn't really know it. And it thinks it can kill you. It thinks it can threaten you. And in some limited ways it can, but it can't ultimately take you down, because I have already defeated death. And so if you believe in me, even if you die, yet will you live. And in fact, those who believe in me will never truly die. John Wayne was famous for saying that courage is shaking in our boots, but saddling up anyway. And I sense this a little bit in this passage as well. I've probably told you before, you may remember, one of my favorite people right now, I don't know her personally, but is a woman named Kate Bowler. She's a professor at Duke Divinity School. And 6 or 8 years ago, she had it all. She was a 35-year-old young mom with the husband who was the love of her life. She was a very young professor at Duke Divinity School. She was kind of at the peak of her career, very early in her career. She had written a book, and it was doing pretty well in the at least the religious world, the academic world, and she kind of had it all. And then she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and she went through all kind of pain and had no guarantees that she was going to survive. Had to figure out what would it be like if she died, leaving behind a young child and a husband and everything that she had loved. And that's kind of transformed her career. She still works some with her previous discipline, but now she really works lots with helping all of us figure out how do we cope with a world that can be so terrifying and can be so painful, and how do we find God in all of that. And she's just released a book in the last month or so that's called Have a Terrible, Beautiful Day. And I want you to see her describing how she came to that phrase that she often says to people, have a terrible, beautiful day. So here is Kate Bowler explaining that to us.
I have a habit of wishing people a beautiful, terrible day, which I think people find off-putting. It came from just like a thought I kept having when I first got sick, which is just that life is so beautiful and life is so hard. And it turns out that there's this perfect quote from a pastor and thinker, Frederick Buechner, and he said, "Here's the world, beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid." I thought that was the perfect encapsulation of the beautiful and the terrible. Is like, welcome to the world. Both will be equally real. Keep your eyes open and your heart soft. So yeah, have a beautiful, terrible day.
And so what I hear her saying is just what Jesus is saying, that we have to acknowledge that there are terrible things in the world. In this world, you will have chaos, you will have persecution, and yet take courage, because in me you will have peace, because you know I've already conquered the world. And so you can see the beauty even as you're feeling the terror. It seems a contradiction. It is a contradiction unless we have the power of Christ in us. And so Jesus, to kind of play with the John Wayne quote and the Kate Bowler quote and what Jesus said, in this world you will face terrible, boot-shaking chaos, but take courage and saddle up. Look for the beauty, for I have already conquered the world. And that is how we can forgive, even in the midst of still having people attack us. That is how we can find beauty, even in the midst of the terror. That is how we can have peace, even when there's chaos all around us, because we have Jesus Christ in our lives. Thanks be to God.